I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose rapture. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, rapture can become your city as well.
One day I awoke with the inexplicable desire to build underwater hamster cities. Who knows why these things happen? Madness is ineffable. But underwater living space is expensive, even when scaled down, so I've had to start small. With sufficient funding, the habitats will become larger and more elaborate. I have devised a way to interconnect them using a modular system of transparent tubing and gate valves, so I can safely establish a network of connected habitats in a nearby lake, pond, or slow-moving river. I'm interested in all sorts of things: space travel, robots, outposts in harsh climates, the triumph of human ingenuity which makes it possible for mankind to live comfortably in places nature never intended, like Florida. The best way to learn is to do, so when I want to learn about robots, I build robots. When I want to learn about rockets, I build rockets. And when I want to build an underwater habitat for a dwarf hamster, I get a refill on my antipsychotics, but ultimately build it anyway, because the Anunnaki reptilian shapeshifters driving my body around like a meat robot always get their way. So, I'm going to build it, because it's interesting and a challenge, because I want to learn firsthand what's involved in designing and constructing a complete underwater habitat capable of sustaining complex organisms. It's a weird hobby, but some of my friends crochet, so I'm in the clear. The nameless engineer behind the underwater hamster habitat project titled Hampture likens his first design to the Aquarius reef base. Hampture is inspired by and portmanteaued with the city of Rapture from the 2008 video game BioShock. The game focuses on a once utopian underwater city that collapsed in on itself after science went too far. The game focuses on the philosophical idea of Randian objectivism, a philosophy created by Ayn Rand, which posits that humankind should live for themselves, reject government, God, and society, and take care of one's own family. This led the people of Rapture to be completely free, but it also led them to do inhumane experiments and create drugs that turned them into mutants, who then did battle with monster robots. And then the city started to flood. Hampshire's goal is to go where no hamster has gone before, and propagate hamster objectivism. At least, that's what the engineer's tongue-in-cheek mission statement is. The project began in 2010 with Hampture Mark I. Mark I used an air pump to restock the air in the enclosure, and also allowed a wire to be run down to power the lights. Like Aquarius, Hampture Mark I will rely on a surface buoy to pump air down to it, in order to keep the water out/refresh the atmosphere, and supply power for the lighting. Unlike Aquarius, Hampture will be a glorious bastion of Randian philosophy as practiced by a single dwarf hamster. Upon testing his first design in a tub and watching it fail epically, the engineer stated, "Will I give up? No, I won't, because I lack the common sense which would otherwise restrain my ambitions." After starting his blog, I Choose Hampture, the engineer received multiple emails from people telling him that one single box wasn't impressive enough, and he was settling for mediocrity. Why not make an interconnected city of multiple enclosures, with electricity powered by hamster wheels and algae that provided oxygen? To give the people what they wanted, he purchased a second enclosure and planned on connecting the two with typical hamster tubes. The problem is that the boxes themselves were weighed down, but he realized that he would have to deal with the problem of the tube wanting to rise up because it had air in it, so he had to find a way to tie the tube down. While designing Mark II, he decided to put a heating pad on the wall so that the hamster could choose whether or not it wanted to be near the heat source, an option it would not have if the pad was on the floor. His current battery was able to power the habitat for a few hours, but he had high hopes that the Mark III would eventually be solar-powered and self-sustainable. The Mark II was just a test that he said appears certain. The day of the test was quickly approaching, and our mad lad acquired a hamster named Mega Supreme. He coated all the wires in the habitat with a liquid that apparently tastes awful, and he watched as the hamster tried to chew it, then immediately backed off. Next came the test launch. First, with the air tube in place, the engineer sealed the chamber for 1 hour, and came back and saw that everything was working perfectly. Next, he placed the container in his bathtub and turned on the water. The sound of the faucet upset the hamster, but he was fine once he was submerged. He let the hamster stay down there, underwater, for an hour, constantly monitoring its progress. What you are seeing now is footage of the hamster during its time underwater. Then the real test came. October 15th, 2010. He submerged the habitat in a swimming pool 8 feet deep for 20 minutes. Then he headed out to a nearby lake. This footage is mission number 1 of the journey to create Hampture. Our buddy Mega Supreme stayed in the lake for 5 hours and everything was a complete success. Our hero, the engineer, found an aquarium online that would make the perfect Hampture. It cost $3,400, and he claimed with his current tools he could have it be self-sustaining, allowing 6 hamsters to live without the need for access to the surface for air or electricity. He claimed that he would never have the funds, so it would always be a goal just out of reach. Since the enclosures he'd been able to find aren't very tall, he had to use running saucers instead of hamster wheels, as the classic wheel wouldn't fit vertically. But the saucers got the job done. He also found a $700 RC submarine that he could mount to a camera to do flybys of the enclosure from the water, or he could put a hamster in it and have it swim around. He was mostly joking about that last part, I hope. On October 22nd, 2010, Mark III was introduced. A 3-room habitat that could house 2 hamsters, Mega Supreme and the new hamstronaut, Hampture Ryan, named for the founder of Rapture. The engineer claimed the base he built could support 2 more rooms when he got to them, which would be enough space for 4 hamsters. The engineer added a growing room for plants, specifically clovers. He didn't want to rely on plants for oxygen, as that could get dangerous, but technically that's what their function would be, and the whole thing is just a big test anyway. Hamsters can safely eat clovers, and all that they required to grow was a simple LED light. Mark III pumped air into each of the side enclosures. From there, they were then pumped out directly into the water. Instead of a battery, Mark III was run off the power grid, and because of the pressure of being underwater, he had to lower it slowly into the lake. After a 6-month hiatus waiting for the water to get warm enough to run the experiment, the engineer developed what he called the Human Centipede Life Support System, where air from the habitat was funneled into a 2-liter soda bottle filled with algae to convert CO2 into oxygen. Then, that air was moved into another 2-liter bottle of algae, then another, and eventually back into the habitat, so that it could be completely air self-sufficient. It was all just a diagram, but he hoped to one day be able to implement it. He did the math and actually started constructing the algae method, determining it would take 18 bottles to support 3 hamsters. Hampture Ryan was eventually joined by Ratless and Nom Tane, more Bioshock references, and they were allowed to explore their new home before it got submerged. Because he's actually insane, The engineer created a real working hamster submarine that was tethered to the habitat with an air cord. There were actually holes in the submarine to constantly let air out and prevent leaks. Unfortunately, he thought that the ability to have it actually enter the enclosure to load and unload hamsters would be impossibly complex, but his idea was still there. In July, the engineer finally found a site for the hamsters. They were to be placed 7 feet underwater, weighted down by cinder blocks. Here is the footage from the first 24-hour mission of Hampture Mark III. The engineer said that based on the battery he used for the air pump, more than 24 hours didn't seem likely to happen. But he did have a pond in his backyard that he wanted to clean up, so that eventually he could tie it directly into the power grid. Then he had his own side project, a homemade diving helmet. He wanted to use it to visit the enclosure underwater. Since the Mark III was so large, it could only really be tested in the lake it was designed for, so the engineer added some rooms to the Mark II and created Mark 2.5. The bedding he used was soil that would both process the hamster waste and grow the clovers. He had a filtration system that allowed the hamsters to drink lake water, and he believed that he could leave the entire thing underwater for as long as the food lasted, which he measured to be about a month. During his newly invigorated thinking process, he also found a solution to his hamster submarine. Because the sub always had an air tube, it couldn't use a typical airlock in order to dock. An airlock is what you see in the movies, whether in an underwater location or out in outer space, where astronauts or divers will enter a room that would slowly fill with water. The outer door would then open, allowing them to go outside. Because of the air tube, this setup would be impossible. So instead, the engineer made a concept using something known as a moon pool. If you've ever forced a bucket underwater upside down, you know that you can have pockets of air underwater. As long as there is a water pump that could empty and fill this docking room, the hamster can safely climb out and get to the main chamber of the habitat, out of the sub. With some more tinkering, Hampture Mark 2.5 was completed October 31st, 2011. Capable of a month underwater, with heated and non-heated rooms, a battery backup and multiple failsafes, it was arguably the most advanced hamster enclosure ever built for its time. But things were just getting started. December 19th, 2011, Mark IV began development, capable of taking hamsters to their maximum safe depth of 20 feet. The engineer also drew out plans for a Mark V that he claimed would cost over $1,000, but would be really awesome. He also made a Dream Mark VI, based on existing devices that you can buy for $30,000. The Mark VI would be strapped in 500 feet deep in the ocean and be completely sustainable, getting energy from ocean currents with its own airlock for delivering food to the hamsters. Head out of the clouds and back on Earth, or underwater, technically, the engineer next designed what he calls a ham lab. These are supposed to be bedrooms for 2 hamsters, with a small shared living space that can dispense clean water. These would be attached to the main compartments to create the feel of an actual city. So the last hypothetical problem was food. No matter how self-sustaining the habitat was, he still had to always unsubmerge it to replenish the food. Or not. The engineer invented what he called a reverse moon pool. He discovered, and I'm not sure how, but he claimed that the hamsters eventually realized that there was water there and he was worried that one would go for a swim. So he designed a reverse moon pool. That's a room that is always full of air until the door is open, in which case water fills it up to the point where this tube ends. Then he can put the food inside, pump the water out, and the hamsters could go down there and collect the food. The only problem would be if a hamster was down there when he wanted to fill it with water, but I'm sure that there's a way around that. He also received a solar panel as a donation, meaning that the battery that pumped the air was now able to go on forever. Speaking of donations, the project was rejected by Kickstarter. Apparently they don't care about the progress of hamsterkind. Money soon dried up from donations, and the project was temporarily halted, but he was able to create a hamster aquapod that he could take with him on journeys with his own diving helmet. I don't think there's ever really a reason to do this, but it's possible. May 29th, 2012. The engineer purchased a 100-gallon aquarium and planned on stocking it with 4 hamster apartments and fish, so that he could live stream the completed Hampture 24/7. His dream was coming to fruition. No more lakes would be needed. He just needed a few more $100 to get all the supplies. This is his final design for Hampture, which he called Phase 1. But this was not his dream. Hamlantis, a permanent 1.1-ton domed structure with a moon pool for diver access, would be the ultimate underwater hamster city. Hamlantis is a permanent underwater world for hamster kind, inside of an 8-foot diameter transparent acrylic dome mounted to a round metal dish with a hole in the center where a human diver can surface to manually transport food, water, and additional hamster knots to this awe-inspiring waste of money. I cannot even begin to calculate how much this would cost, although I do know that a 5.75-foot diameter dome runs $617. I couldn't find the place I inquired with before that sold 8-foot diameter domes, but, suffice to say, the prices were banane. Worse yet, the total amount of lead ballast weights needed to keep this retard's fantasy from floating is 1.1 tons. This would require a boat trailer, removable floats, and several friends with scuba gear to deploy in a lake. On September 28, 2012, the engineer announced mission accomplished. He could theoretically keep the habitat submerged for several years, the lifespan of a hamster, and adding more rooms would just mean more cleaning when he did raise it to deliver food. He removed the hamsters from their underwater objectivist utopia and allowed them to live the remainder of their lives on land. He had proved what he had set out to do. On January 11, 2014, the last of the 4 original hamster knots passed away, and Hampture, much like the city it was based off of, was no more, merely a memory. Then a week later, he had a new brain blast. The engineer discovered a valve that could act like an airlock door that could be opened and closed from the outside of the enclosure. He came up with a plan to put one of each of these on the walls of every room so that they could potentially be expanded and rearranged at will. This also meant he could remove a single room for cleaning or restocking without having to bring the entire enclosure up. He could even add more rooms to the base while the whole thing was underwater. Suddenly, the idea of an iterative hamster city was a reality. Freshly rejuvenated, the engineer bought 2 more hamsters, Cousteau, named for the French naval officer who invented the aqualung, and Nemo, named for Captain Nemo from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. In the years since the project began, larger, clear waterproof containers have been released to the market, so the engineer began to design Ham Base Delta, which could connect to the original Ham Lab via the new valve he discovered. The engineer also made a new pod for plants to grow that could potentially provide oxygen. Further development stalled for several years, and the second generations of hamster knots died of old age in 2016. They were replaced with George and Scott. On February 27, 2016, those hamsters made their maiden voyage underwater. Until the engineer could produce an above-ground swimming pool or a clear small body of water, there wasn't much he could do to advance the project. So, good thing on July 4th, 2016, the engineer did just that. The engineer next hypothesized hydropower and drew this diagram. He was confident that, with proper, expensive setup, he could create an enclosure that could remain underwater for 3 years, the lifespan of a dwarf hamster. Unfortunately, George and Scott would not live to see this habitat come to fruition. Rip George and Scott. I went on vacation recently, leaving a certain roommate in charge of feeding my hamsters. In retrospect, I should not have entrusted him with this task. I arrived home to find them dead in their cages because he'd forgotten about them. Because of this, I've had him evicted. I will be holding off on buying new hamsters for a while to mourn the loss of George and Scott. They were very old at least, and lived full lives. Still, it's an infuriatingly senseless way for them to die. In December, the engineer adopted 2 new hamsters, Jim and Jade. February 15th, 2019. The engineer showed off how his docking lock works. He had to drill his own hole and attach the hatch with Flex Seal. After seeing the success of his first leak test, he said that if he had known it would be this easy, he would have done it years earlier when he first came up with the design. Next, he began adding the hatches to the Mega Lab. He explained his desire to create a ring of modules, alternating large and small sizes, to make an actual hamster city. He added a dome to the large enclosure to make it more see-through, and found a flexible tube due to the height difference. The hamster seemed to enjoy it. Now all he had to do was replace the lid of the black box with a transparent window so that light could get inside. Then, what he dubbed Mega Lab could be constructed. The engineer uploaded a commentated video overlooking the enclosure.
Guess what came in the mail today? It's a dome and your face is gay. It's a whole song. Well, here goes nothing. Wow, that went a lot better than expected. Okay, so I need to do some sanding around the hole because it's still really rough, but I couldn't wait. Check this out. How cool is that? I'm really warming up to it. Originally, I was just disappointed when I got this in the mail that the lid wasn't clear, and all I could think of was how do I make it as close to that as possible. But if you go and look at screenshots from BioShock and go replay the game, the entire structure of Rapture was not transparent. They had these overhead skylights that were either domes or hemicylinders, and this is really going to recapture the feel of that. It's also going to make it look more like an underwater habitat than just a submerged, mostly transparent box.
May 30th, 2019. Lamenting over the fact that he couldn't figure out a reasonable way to make a hamster version of Columbia, the floating city from BioShock Infinite, the engineer instead created a pod attached to a drone that could fit in one of his hamsternauts. Jade, the previous master of sea and land, reached an altitude of 400 feet on her flight and came back perfectly fine. This was a first for hamsterkind, leaving one frontier left, outer space, but the engineer says that will be a job for someone else. October 20th, 2019. The first actual test of underwater docking. The habitat on the right is sealed via a sliding hatch. The engineer is able to screw the two habitats together. Then he has to purge water from the tunnel with an air hose. There's actually two holes in the tunnel that repel water. Because the cages have higher pressure than the water, openings in the tunnel actually push leaks out instead of letting water in. That's why this whole thing is so safe. Once it's drained, he's able to open both hatches and the hamster can explore an entirely new room that didn't exist in his world until a minute ago. No gods or kings, only hamsters. The engineer has his share of detractors. Despite making it clear that the hamsters spend time on land, despite explaining the science of how it's nearly impossible for the habitats to leak, and how hamsters have such poor eyesight that they have no idea they're underwater, and despite the fact that nothing bad has happened to any of his hamsters, he gets lots of hate comments. This is messed up. #end Hampture. How are people supporting him? This is outrageous. I don't care if it's complex to clean or build, a hamster shouldn't be living in. This, a hamster, that is being abused. You have not done research at all at Hamster Care, and you're saying it's fine because he or she has a wheel? You clearly have not done research if you want to watch a hamster channel who actually care about hamster, can give them the best live. I recommend Air and Animals. Please don't support him. Well, that's one way to kill an animal via stress and bad husbandry. I'm sorry, but this is cruel. It's a hamster, not a fish. The enclosure is way too small. What happens if it fails and the poor hamster drowns? How big is the enclosure? And what size do you recommend for a normal-sized 1-for-1 dwarf hamster? At least 450 square inches. I use a 200-quart bin from Walmart for my hamsters. What this kid id doing is disgusting. I always find it funny how whenever people online are complaining about someone, they always call him a kid, even though the engineer is clearly in his 30s. I also googled it, and dwarf hamsters can actually do fine in cages that are 288 square inches, so this guy is literally just making stuff up. Wow, this is unbelievably disturbing. This is absolutely disgusting. How is anyone okay with that? That cage is way too small for that poor hamster. You treat him like some test object. Disgusting. Please, stop doing this to these hamsters. This is extremely dangerous, and they could easily die. Hamsters cannot get wet. If they do, they can die, so putting them in a tank is a bad idea. If you can't take care of your hamsters properly and give them a good life, you shouldn't own them. If you want to give them a good life, check out YouTubers like Victoria Rachel, who does proper hamster care videos. Please stop. People on Reddit also made up wholesale lies that the engineer is a pedophile who was arrested for raping a 14-year-old girl, and was sentenced to 100,000 hours of community service and was disowned by his family. This is verifiably false because there are no records of him committing any crimes. He even has a video where he searches his name across publicly available databases to show that he has no criminal records. He was even living with his family during the recording of that video. It is pretty disgusting that people would make that kind of thing up to discredit someone who wants to make habitats for hamsters. It's also kind of weird that several of the comments are recommending other hamster YouTube channels to watch. You'd think that they would be smart enough to know that the engineer's audience is not hamster lovers, it's people who are invested in the habitat. It's also weird how this is one of only 3 of his videos with this kind of dislike ratio. Every comment I just showed you is from one single video. It seems like someone shared it with a group of people to pile on hate. Thankfully, he didn't listen to them, because they're morons. The engineer responded to one of the comments with this: "Somebody already called an animal rights place on me. They told them the hamsters do not appear agitated, the habitat is not filling with water, etc., so they can't do anything and it's not illegal. You're welcome to try too, until you accept that you're not in charge of strangers." He uploaded a video explaining his side of the argument and dispelling myths. Note, he isn't wearing the glasses here to hide his identity, he's done full face reveals before, it's just part of his mad scientist costume.
Luxray is among a handful of Redditors who had a strong negative reaction to seeing a hamster living underwater, and assumed the absolute worst of me without looking into any of the precautions I've taken. These precautions include the positive pressure design, which can leak bubbles but not admit water, doubly redundant air compressors, battery backup, heated floors, dehumidified air, desiccant litter, a thermometer and hygrometer combo inside the habitat for monitoring temperature and humidity, and of course a live camera feed of the aquarium accessible on my phone from anywhere in the world. Even when these precautions are explained, the outrage mob does not put down their pitchforks. They had a knee-jerk reaction to something they didn't understand, but they feel the need to justify it. So no matter how much they're wrong about, they just keep doubling down. Some of these people have asked, what's wrong with me? The answer, as though it wasn't obvious, is autism. I'm an autistic adult. This is the first project I've had enough success with that I was able to support myself independently for a time, and she wants to take that away. I'm sure she'd like to see me on the street, which I'm also no stranger to, hence my video recently about how to help the homeless. Luxray is a prime exemplar of cancel culture. Literally anything anybody does that attracts a large enough audience will become a target. With enough eyeballs on the project, some subculture somewhere will have a problem with what you're doing for some reason, and it only takes a few people to get you canceled. One of the other instigators, perhaps both of them, but one of them for sure, is a furry communist. I don't know if I mentioned that yet. That's kind of poetic that a communist would try to take down Hampture. I made a long post explaining the precautions I've taken in the Reddit thread about this project on the animal rights subreddit. But the communist furry I mentioned earlier is a mod of that sub and deleted it, along with every post which took my side. That should not surprise anybody, as censorship is the first resort of such people. They will cry about the rights of hamsters, even while taking your rights away. Not only your rights, but your livelihood. choosing according to their own belief system who may live their lives and who will be busted down to poverty. For such class-conscious people, they sure cause a lot of poverty and homelessness. The most frustrating thing about this experience has been their reaction to my corrections. Initially, nearly every accusation they made was false. But even when corrected on those wrong assumptions, one by one, they never changed their minds because their feeling of outrage did not diminish. They seem to think that if they feel morally virtuous, they can't be wrong. There's no arguing with that feeling. They won't listen, nothing will change their minds. Despite the getup, I'm obviously not a real scientist, nor am I mad, just annoyed currently. Accordingly, the hamsters are not test subjects. They are beloved pets. I'm not testing any hypothesis. The only testing that happens is of every new habitat for 72 hours in the aquarium without a hamster inside, just to ensure that everything is watertight and that it's safe for occupation. There's a land cage and a underwater habitat, and there's a hamster in each at any given time, but once a month they trade places. This means only half their lives are spent underwater. The other half is spent in a much larger, more spacious land cage. And in addition to that, I occasionally take them out when the weather is nice so they can have outdoor adventures in the park. I really feel like this would have been less controversial if the public knew that nobody in history has ever died due to drowning in an underwater habitat, of which there have been about 70 so far. They trap air at the same pressure as the outside water, so I could, in fact, drill a hole in the lid, and provided it was a small hole, air would bubble out, but water would not enter. The danger factor, which is of course what makes it compelling, is largely an illusion. Positive pressure underwater habitats are fantastically safe and idiot-proof. That's all, I guess.
Unfortunately, the engineer's words did little to convince his detractors. On December 15th, 2019, Home Base Alpha, the habitat that had been in use for almost 10 years, sprang a leak while the engineer was asleep. This of course provided a lot of ammo for the Reddit complainers, but the engineer looked at the situation differently. The water stopped rising at the opening of the tube. The air pressure of that opening made it so no more water could enter the enclosure. The hamster was safe in the other room, and no harm was done. But, had there only been one enclosure, the hamster, which could easily have died if it had been wet for extended periods of time, likely would not have made it until the engineer woke up. The corona pandemic and the George Floyd riots slowed the progress of Hampture, as the US Postal Service was greatly impacted by the pandemic, and the local stores the engineer went to buy supplies from were shut down due to the riots. The most recent update from the engineer is a video about Ham Bunker, a subterranean hamster bunker that is 2 levels deep and has webcams monitoring hamsters 24/7. Hamsters live in holes in the wild, so this is a natural habitat for them. There is also one layer that is above ground. Right now, you can watch a 24/7 live stream of the bunker at twitch.tv/hambunker, and a 24/7 live stream of Hampture at twitch.tv/Hampture. On the FAQ section of his Twitch channel, the engineer answers questions about the project. He says that Hamlumbia, a floating hamster city, is too expensive because of the cost of helium. No hamsters have ever drowned, and they spend time on land and underwater. The purpose of the project is fun, although there are practical applications in study for the future of human habitation underwater. And of course, he wants to create a utopia for objectivist hamsters to not be ruled over by the surface dwellers, at least until the atom drives them mad. In the description, I have included links to both of his Twitch streams, his blog, and his YouTube channel. If you would like to see progress move forward for all of hamster kind, you can also donate to his Patreon. Also, a thank you to my patrons: A Humble Narcissist, Tacos, Ash Perler, Blue Coon, Elijah, Greedy, Hunter, Hypercube Labs, Jose, Joseph, Caitlin, Poe, Randy, Shadow Nexa, Snotling, Steve, twitch.tv/Suma Breakup, and Benjamins.
Here we are once again. We've really got to stop meeting like this, you know? Sometimes I wonder what it's like to have normal, sane person hobbies. I remember in kindergarten, they were like, what do you want to be when you grow up? You can become anything that you set your mind to. And I said, I want to build underwater cities for hamsters. And the teacher leaned in, got real close, and whispered, pick something else.